Welcome everybody. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord God, our Father, we praise and thank you for the gift of your word. As we reflect on it today, open our hearts and our minds to its power through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Okay, there's going to be one little change beginning next week. We now have our all-school masses on Thursday. So Bible study will come after the all-school mass. If you're watching us, that's probably 9:45. Okay, from Matthew. At that time, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. Now, Tyre and Sidon are in pagan territory. And behold, a Canaanite woman of that district came and called out, "Have pity on me, Lord, son of David." Of course, there's going to be pagan people coming to Jesus because he's in pagan territory. And one of the things in Mark's gospel, Mark calls the woman a Syro-Phoenician woman, and Matthew calls her a Canaanite. Canaanites were always enemies of the people. And it's interesting, she calls out, here's an enemy, a pagan, saying, "Have pity on me, Lord, son of David." So she calls him by his correct title. Now, she's going to address him 3 times. This is the first time. She says, "My daughter is tormented by a demon." But Jesus did not say a word in answer to her, which seems really cruel. So here's the Lord of compassion and mercy, just ignoring this poor woman who has faith. Jesus' disciples came and asked him, "Send her away, for she keeps calling out after us." He said in reply, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." So remember that St. Matthew is writing to Jewish Christians, and they want to know what is our, as the gospel, as Christianity spreads to the Gentiles, what's our role? Well, their role was, Jesus comes first to them. He's a Jew himself. But also remember that at the end of Matthew's gospel, Jesus is going to say, "Go out and preach to all nations, all nations." And also in Matthew's infancy narratives, the first group to encounter the newborn Christ is not Jewish shepherds, they're the pagan magi. So clearly in Matthew's gospel, and even Jesus going into pagan territory, that's his intention, but it begins with Judaism. So here's the second time. She's persistent. "But the woman came and did Jesus homage, saying, 'Lord, help me.' So she threw herself on the ground." And this is awful. He said in reply, "It is not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs." I mean, that sounds really, really insulting. It's really insulting. Didn't stop her. Here's the third time. She said, "Please, Lord, for even the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the table of their masters." Then Jesus said to her in reply, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And the woman's daughter was healed from that hour. So we always remember that as awful as this sounds, the gospel is for everyone, and Matthew makes that very clear. So the woman comes to Jesus with faith. She perseveres. She doesn't give up, and she's very humble. She says, "I'll take whatever you can give me." And really, these are the dispositions necessary for prayer of petition. Coming to Jesus with faith, being perseverant, and then have the humility to accept what happens to us.
And it's interesting, the cities of Tyre and Sidon are coastal cities. They're actually in the country of Lebanon now, but they're north of Haifa. So those of us that were in the Holy Land, you remember Haifa, we were up on the hill, we're looking down over those beautiful Baha'i gardens, looking down at the port. And so these 2 cities are actually north of that. When the woman first approaches Jesus, you'll notice how she addresses him, Lord. So obviously Jesus' reputation has preceded him. Here she already has the gift of faith, and she's acknowledging him as Lord. And that "Lord, have pity on me," or "have pity on me, Lord," that's basically what we say in the penitential act at the beginning of every Mass. "Lord, have mercy." So that's her first interaction with him, is she's asking for his mercy. And then the second time, she just says, just simply, Lord, help me. She's accepting his lordship, and she's saying, I'm putting my petition in front of you, but your will be done, much like Jesus said in the garden. Father, not my will, but thy will be done, right? So she's just kind of putting herself there. And then the third time, please, Lord, for even the dogs eat the scraps. What she's saying, she's accepting that she has no claim on him as the God of Israel or as the Messiah, but she's still asking for his help anyway. So again, that's just that beautiful faith and perseverance and persistence and humility. I was trying to figure out why this passage was presented the way it was in Matthew's gospel. And it's only in Matthew and Mark, by the way. It's not in all the synoptics. It's only in Matthew and Mark. But I got an insight into it when I looked at the passage that comes immediately before it. Because immediately before this passage, in both Matthew and Mark, Jesus has had an interaction with the Pharisees, and the Pharisees say, well, why don't your disciples wash their hands before they eat, right? That ritual washing that the Jews always take part in, that we still use in the Mass, that the priests ritually wash their hands before they begin the Eucharistic prayer.
I know I say to the server, more water, I have more sense than that. That's not enough.
Okay, not going there. Anyway, but Jesus very clearly says that it is not what comes from without that defiles a person. It's what comes from within. He says, what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a man. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defiles a man, but not what comes from without. So putting that in perspective, I'm thinking, well, maybe that Jesus is trying to reiterate to his disciples in a very, very real and tangible way that it doesn't matter where he is or where they are. Typically, going into Gentile territory would make them ritually unclean, but he takes them there anyway. Again, to kind of stress the fact that it's not what comes from without that defiles a person. So it doesn't matter where he is or how he presents his message, the message is still true, right, on what comes from within. Good reminder to all of us. And then when he talks about it is not right to take the food of the children and throw it to the dogs, another commentary I read said that word can also be translated specifically as bread. So very Eucharistic overtones here, right? It's not fair to take the bread of the children and give it to the dogs. So very, very Eucharistic here. And referring to the Gentiles as dogs does seem really harsh to us, but we have to put this in perspective. At the time, that's how Jews referred to the Gentiles, right? Because they saw them as being ignorant of God and his ways. They saw them as being corrupt and religiously backward. So the Jews referred to the Gentiles as dogs. So that was, it's less of Jesus putting them down and more of something that his apostles and then by extension, the Jewish Christians would understand, right? Because that was a common terminology for them. So also, given that this is Matthew writing this, the initial reluctance of Jesus in this passage to acknowledge the woman could also reflect the early Christian community's hesitancy to accept Gentiles into their midst. That was a big controversy at the time. How much do they have to convert to Judaism first before they can become Christian? That was a big controversy. So that was also could be part of it. But when we get down to the very basics of all of this, I think the lessons we need to take out of this is first that the church has to listen to the persistent cries of the poor and the marginalized. That's our job. That's social justice. And that's what we need to do. And also we can take out of this that Jesus is testing the woman. Just like we go through tests, right? He's testing her so that she can learn how great her faith is, and he's preparing her to receive the gift of his mercy that he wants to give her. You know, think of people that go through RCIA, right? That's a process. And you have to learn, you have to be open gradually to what he wants to give. And that gift of grace, which he does give, is freely given for the sake of all. It's not earned, it's not deserved, but it's given anyway. And that's the other thing that we need to remember. All right.
The first reading is from Isaiah. Actually, this is third Isaiah. So you can divide Isaiah into three parts. The first 40 chapters are the historical Isaiah speaking to his people. The next section is probably a disciple of Isaiah who speaks in the exile, giving the people hope. And then third Isaiah is a disciple who is speaking to his people once they return to Jerusalem from exile. So this is third Isaiah. And what they've learned in being in exile is that God is not tied to the land. You know, there was a concept that, you know, that when you would go to another territory, well, the gods, whoever the gods were in that territory, they were in charge. And they learned from their exile, God was with them. You know, in their exile, God isn't tied to the land. So he says, thus says the Lord, observe what is right, do what is just, for my salvation is about to come, my justice about to be revealed. So they've returned to Jerusalem, they've rebuilt the temple, and of course, at the heart of prayer in the temple is sacrifice. Well, they weren't able to do that in Babylon. And so this is a deeper understanding of the Lord's presence. The foreigners who join themselves to the Lord, ministering to him, loving the name of the Lord, and becoming his servants. So that's what was happening. You know, they intermarried. They brought people back who shared their faith. You know, they weren't Jewish, but they shared their faith. All who keep the Sabbath free from profanation. So, you know, this is what's important. Not just sacrifices, but keeping the Sabbath free from profanation and hold to my covenant. Them I will bring to my holy mountain. That's where the temple is, on Mount Zion, and make joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be acceptable in my offer. So, you know, that they're, you know, we'll continue the sacrifices. The ones they bring are fine, but the real sacrifices are what he mentioned beforehand. For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. You know, and what's interesting about all three readings is that all three readings talk about the universality of God's love.
It's interesting if you notice, if you go through and count, Isaiah has the Lord say, my, 7 times. Remember, numbers are always significant in the Bible. 7 is a number of completion. So this is God speaking to his people. My salvation, my justice, my covenant, my holy mountain, my house of prayer, my altar. And then again, my house shall be called a house of prayer. And what God is God is stressing through Isaiah here is that physical descent from a common ancestor like Abraham is less important than observance of God's will is. The observance of his will, living by the covenant, that's what's really important. And Israel was a people set apart, the chosen people, not just for themselves, but for the world. They were intended to bring God's salvation to the world, to share that gift with the world. And that's at the end there, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Isaiah presents the Sabbath observance as a central element of Jewish society, and it absolutely was. But then he expands those parameters to include everyone at the end of the reading. And so that's the important part there, is that it's as Father said, the universality.
And Psalm 67 is a psalm that gives thanks for the harvest. And St. Paul, talking to the Romans, is talking about universal love. Brothers and sisters, I'm speaking to you Gentiles, because as much as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, so Paul, he says that's his mission, that's his ministry, to bring the message of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles. I glory in my ministry in order to make my race jealous and thus save some of them. He wants to make his fellow Jews jealous, and hopefully some of them will follow his example. For if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? So he's saying, if they embrace Jesus as Savior, that's reconciliation, and they'll be through baptism be saved from death. For the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. Just as you once disobeyed God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience, so they have now disobeyed in order that by virtue of the mercy shown to you, they too may now receive mercy. So he's talking about mercy. That's what happens in baptism. Whether you're an infant or an adult, you're freed from sin, original sin or actual sin. For God delivered all to disobedience that he might have mercy upon all. So he's saying everybody's a sinner, and God's mercy is irrevocable.
And if you remember from last Sunday, Paul was talking about the great sadness he had because he had taken the message to his fellow Jews and they turned their backs on him. So now he's turning to the Gentiles saying, okay, well, if they're going to turn their back on me, listen, I'm going to give you this message, and maybe, just maybe, some of them will be jealous and get this message anyway, which I think is it's very cute, very Paul.
Yes. Yeah.
But he talks about, for if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? And think about, Jesus says that you can do nothing if you are separated from me, right? And he talks about that the vine has to be attached to the roots. So think about that being grafted back on. People that have rejected God, through his mercy, we get grafted back on. So that lifeblood is flowing back to us through that graft, through that mercy. And for the gifts of God and the call of God are irrevocable. Think of baptism here. When we are baptized, we are marked. A character is a mark, is put on our soul that identifies us as belonging to Christ, as belonging to God. And that's what he's talking about. Once we accept that, we are part of God's family. Doesn't matter if we get mad at him and storm away, we're still going to be part of his family. Doesn't matter if we sin, we're still going to be part of his family. And he's still going to give us those gifts of grace and mercy and healing. And the grace, the adoption, the charisms that he gives us that we use to serve the church, the mercy that he gives us, no matter how much we turn our backs on them, he'll still give them to us. And because Israel rejected the Messiah's promise, he's now extending that to all through the Gentiles. And I think that's everything. That's all my notes. Okay.
I think that's fabulous. So remember, we'll just start 15 minutes later next week. If Father doesn't have to Mass, it may be 20 minutes later.
Yeah, because we can only do one live stream at a time. So he's got to keep his homilies a little shorter.
I keep reminding him.
I know. All right. We'll see.